Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we take a look at perhaps one of the most important aspects for all armies in times of war: food. What was it like? How much was there of it? How did it get to the men on the front lines? And how did these things change as the war progressed? We discuss this and a lot more during this episode. Well, hi Dan. Last time we recorded an episode, you were in the great Belgian city of Ypres. And as we begin this episode, you're actually somewhere else. You're continuing your tours around Europe. So why don't you tell the listeners where you're recording from today?
Yeah, hi Spence. I'm joining you from the beautiful countryside around Monte Cassino. So in inverted commas, wrong war as far as we're concerned for today's podcast. But, you know, it's a very impressive place to be. So very, very happy to be joining you, especially with a beautiful view like I've got right now. And really looking forward to this episode. Going to be very exciting. Now, it's a big subject, understandably, Spence, and it's got its different nuances as we go through different nationalities at war. But is it fair to say that at the very outbreak of war, the importance of food was never really overlooked? It was always something that was on the mind, particularly of senior commanders on the battlefield.
It was, and really, how could it be anything else? Since really the dawn of organised warfare, a fundamental question you have to ask is how are you going to feed your troops? You assemble a large number of troops, and indeed a large number of horses in the time of the First World War. They're going to have to eat something. And there's that old maxim that's associated with Napoleon. It sounds like the kind of thing he probably would have said, which is an army fights on its stomach. Therefore, if it doesn't get enough food, if it's not fed enough, supplies don't work, the army simply cannot fight. And history is actually full of examples of this, stretching right back to antiquity, of armies who don't take care of their food supply really coming unstuck in longer campaigns. And one thing to note in the period coming up to the First World War is that the industrialization of much of Europe, all of Western Europe, certainly large portions of Eastern Europe too, meant that there was a lot more food supply, but there was also a lot more people. And as steam transport and indeed motor transport was coming of age in the years just before the First World War, combined with refrigerated ships, there was actually more and more opportunity to store food, process food, and move food around. The problem was that was fine in civilian periods. It was a bit different when you'd assembled an enormous army that might be moving off rail lines, might be moving off roads, moving into areas of countryside or even wilderness. And that's when the really hard work of, keeping the food up with the soldiers and making sure they always had something to eat comes in. And logistics is perhaps a slightly different topic that we'll really get into in the future, I'm sure. What we're looking at today is food. And one thing that the armies did have in 1914 that Napoleon's armies did not was a humble but incredibly important invention, which was the field kitchen, Dan.
It was indeed, and field kitchens are going to really come into their own as we go in, really from 1914 onwards. And I think it's one of those overlooked and maybe slightly mundane, slightly unsexy part of the history of warfare. But the truth is, it's absolutely vital because it allows people to eat on the move. Now, I just want to, before we go into that in detail, I just want to go back a step quickly because as you were talking there and describing particularly Napoleon's armies, I was thinking across the wire there to Wellington in his Peninsular campaign from really 1809 up to about 1814. His army is effectively 3 times really hamstrung by the fact that his logistics lines are stretched, specifically because he's got such problems delivering things, other things as well, but specifically food. Being able to sustain an army on the march, in the field, particularly big numbers, very, very tricky to do. Especially when the best you can do in terms of preserved food is either double-baked biscuits or heavily salted and barreled things like pork and beef, which will eventually spoil and are almost unpalatable if you salt them the amount that you need to stop them from spoiling. So there's a couple of really key things. And I would put even before the field kitchen, I would put one other invention, which is I think is the possibility of tinning or canning being something that absolutely revolutionizes warfare and the way warfare can be fought. Because for the first time, you can get small packaged, non-spoiling amounts of food brought up, given to individual soldiers, carried by individual soldiers on the march, and in order to effectively extend the range that soldiers can fight. What do you think of tinning or canning as that goes in terms of its impact on warfare, Spence?
It's huge because it means that the armies aren't completely reliant on fresh food or hard biscuit, preserved biscuit, which has been the standard emergency long life ration really since the 1800s. And tin food, though perhaps now in the 21st century doesn't quite have the reputation that it did a century ago, in the period up to the First World War, tin food was actually considered a little bit of a, not a technical marvel, but a really great invention, a really great feature of the modern age as it was understood in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, because it was nutritious, it was high in calories, you could get decent taste in it. The fact that it was full of salt often added to that taste, but that doesn't really matter. To the average person eating it, it was quite pleasant. And crucially, it could last for a long time, which made storing it in your home, your house, so much easier. When you add that into soldiers and you start including this, then for militaries, it's actually, in some ways, it's essential. It's an essential prerequisite for keeping armies of this enormous size in the field. And I've actually seen it suggested that the invention of tin food makes the gigantic armies of the First World War possible, because feeding that number of troops nothing but fresh food is basically impossible. You can't do it. Even with refrigeration, you're just going to run out of food sooner or later. Whereas tin food, because of its high calorie content, keeps soldiers going. We'll get into what's in the tins in a moment. Some of these tins are actually quite popular with soldiers. They actually quite like what's in the tin. And so it's really essential, especially for the British and the British Empire. And all armies use tin foods. But Britain really, really goes for tinned foods. And so the importance of tinned foods, combined with field kitchens, which can cook fresh food very quickly and produce reasonably nutritious meals from the ingredients available, the armies of the First World War are, by comparison with the armies of Napoleon's day, much more consistently fed, whereas the armies of Napoleon's day quite often lived off the land, so there were good days and there were bad days. One thing to really note about the First World War, with some periods of the war that are an exception, is the soldiers are at least eating a reasonably consistent amount of food. And they actually get quite a lot of it, Dan, although not a lot of variety in the diet.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is something that's overlooked to a certain extent. We quite often hear about, people starving in the trenches, and that old story that I love to repeat. I'm not going to do it this time, about somebody wanting, having to eat rats in the First World War. Well, not really necessary. There's plenty of food around. Generally, as you say, very high calorie, and I think this is the baseline of if you like, the premise of this episode. The point here being, it takes a lot of calories to sustain an active existence on the Western Front. And that's true of all sides, and it's true for all periods of the war. Basically, you burn a hell of a lot of calories in fighting on the Western Front. In order to sustain that, you need to intake a lot of calories. In fact, you could argue that the part of the war is lost as a result of this kind of calorie war that goes on behind the broader war, in which the Germans really struggle, particularly towards the end of it. But yeah, high calories, high intake, a little bit boring, very monotonous in some cases. But of course, soldiers being soldiers, they find other ways to get around it. So let's have a think of some of the major foods that we're going to find out on the Western Front. And of course, the famous one you've mentioned already, the kind of long life standard reserve of the time, is going to be this hard tack. So this is going to be army baked biscuits, which are hard as nails, and you find in museums, including the Imperial War Museum today, still there, probably still edible, probably still taste as bad as they did at the time, but these things will last forever. They can be dipped in tea, they can kind of be broken down to a certain extent, but you've got a kind of standard baseline there. Now, let's be fair, on an average day, most people are not going to be eating that. You're going to be eating things that are much fresher. Bread, for example. Lots of bread available, particularly for the Germans, in fact. But British troops find a lot of bread on the Western Front. British troops also have cheese, which are significantly more than their German counterparts. Cheese is very popular. Again, it's fairly long lasting, and there's a bit of a method here in that anything that's really long lasting and still, in inverted commas, fresh is popular. So tinned jam, and no doubt we'll come back to that, of which the tins are famously used for have another application on the battlefield. Bacon being another one. I've got a great story from a memoir that I read a little while ago, and it was a man by the name of Company Sergeant Major George Gregory, who talks about, I think it's late 1914, just around Christmas of 1914. Talks about the famous quartermasters, the guys organising these rations and sending them up to the front. He's commanding a section at that time, and he says one day a big slab of bacon arrives for his section. And he says, by the time it gets up here, he says, some fool had forgotten to wrap it in newspaper. And by the time it reached us, it had more hair on it from the Hessian sandbag than when the thing was alive in the first place, which I think is quite nice, really. But it is arriving. It is getting there. Bacon's arriving, cheese is arriving, bread's arriving. This is either getting cooked in the front lines as a kind of breakfast meal on little Dixies, little burners. Occasionally it's cooked, and we can go through the kind of the daily routine in a moment. Cooked in other methods, sometimes behind the lines, sometimes not cooked at all, depending on the type of food it is. And then famously, Spencer, we've got the iconic bully beef, which is not particularly popular. The French do have another version, which they refer to as singe, which literally means monkey. It's a nondescript meat. They know it's meat. They don't know which animal it is, but it's known as singe, so monkey. And I don't think that one was particularly popular either. But as you say, high calories, lots of it.
And crucially as well, easy to access. Bully beef in particular, as unpleasant as I think it would be to the modern palate, and as unpleasant as it can be, particularly in hot weather, to the soldiers in the front line. Bully beef crucially has an advantage. It can be eaten cold. The two fundamental main meals, if you will, of the British Army in tins are bully beef or the ubiquitous meat and veg, which comes out as a sort of stew. Meat and veg in particular is better when it's served cooked. It's nicer when it's warmed up. Bully beef, from what I understand, is as unpalatable warm as it is cold. But what it is it's pretty nutritious and it's quite filling. It's a sort of, listeners, if you're not entirely sure what bully beef is, it's a sort of very, very calorie dense, quite fatty, corned beef style pate that can actually turn into solid blocks in certain conditions and become frozen into your tin. But you can eat it cold, which is quite useful. And you can then supplement this with a ubiquitous sweet treat that the British Army, and by extension, of course, all the Empire armies have, which is plum and apple jam, which is so common and so ubiquitous that, in fact, there are musical songs sung about plum and apple jam back in Britain. And plum and apple jam is extremely sweet. It's British soldiers love a sweet treat. In fact, so do all soldiers of all armies in this time. And plum and apple jam, I've read, can't be proved this, but it's attributed to some very, very poor dental conditions of returning soldiers by the early 1920s. Now, that might owe a lot more to the poor state of British dentistry in this period, but eating tin after tin after tin of this very sweet plum and apple jam, which is heavily supplemented with sugar, probably plays a role. But what's interesting to me, Dan, is about these tins. If you eat a good tin of meat and veg, perhaps you've heated it, and you supplement it with some plum and apple jam, and then you wash it down with a mug of tea, usually with 5 or 6 sugars in it. Something that's always struck me is how many sugars soldiers actually put in their tea. Is you've actually got quite a high calorie meal there, and it might not be the most nutritious, but one thing to really get across to the listeners is soldiers, and this is true of all armies, eat a lot more meat than the equivalent civilians did either before the war or during the war. The quantity of meat that is eaten by soldiers of all fighting nations is much, much higher. And as we all know, meat, rich source of protein, it's nutritious. If you're out being very physically active on the front line, you're going to need plenty of this. So having tins of meat, even if they're not really the tastiest, they're not really the finest cuts of meat, doesn't matter. It's still going to be very welcome to you, especially if it's cold in the trenches or it's raining, as it so often is. You don't read too often of soldiers in memoirs or in letters might complain about the monotony of the food, might complain occasionally they've got a bad batch of tins that have been bashed or dented and the food's gone bad. Don't think anybody would choose bully beef if they had an option of something else. But generally, you don't get soldiers complaining about the quantity of food, at least not from the Allied side.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important point to make there. It was certainly, yeah, absolutely, as you say, from the Allied side. I'd imagine if you ask a German in 1918 about quantities of food, it might be a very different story. And of course, when we think about these kind of things, there's a few corners that can be cut as well, and a few things that you can do to make what might be a very monotonous sequence of meals more interesting. And one of those, and bear in mind, we're talking predominantly about time in the front lines here. So stews, bread, cheese, bacon, jam, lots of tea. You'll find these whilst you're in a frontline situation. Behind the lines, the story can be very different. We'll maybe come on to that in a minute. But one of the things that you'd also find, and my understanding is this is very, very common today as well, is quite literally spicing up those meals. Bully beef might not be so bad if you can douse it with Worcester sauce or something along those lines. And these kind of condiments are found, absolutely. In fact, classically in a soldier's pack, you're going to find, as well as the classic tobacco and cigarette smoking and all of those kind of little personal items, you're going to inevitably find something like HP sauce, which is an absolute favorite at the time. Dump a load of that over bully beef and you can make it a little more palatable. Lots of salt, pepper, spices, all of these kind of things that are available just to make it more interesting. So we certainly see plenty of that. And in fact, soldiers in sections typically will pool their condiments. So if you're in a frontline section for 4 days, it might be that Tommy over there gets HP sauce, somebody else gets a Worcester sauce, and you can kind of mix and match just to make something a little more palatable. And it makes sense if you understand the amount of time people are spending in trenches. It's perfectly normal. And with a great postal system, and in fact, other food sometimes being sent up to supplement those rations, people can really get by quite well. I've got to make an honourable mention for one that doesn't fall into the food category, Spence, but was certainly on the minds of all Tommies at the time, and that's the iconic tot of rum. Quite literally, a couple of tablespoons of rum, which are going to be given to a soldier each day, and they tend to perk up the soldiers, make things a little bit better. There's some suggestion the phrase Dutch courage has some interest from there. Usually, quite often given before battle, but even just on a daily basis as well. One thing that's really interesting about the old tot of rum is that they famously come up in rum ration jars along with the rest of the food ration, which comes up labelled SRD, Supply Reserve Depot. Of course, famously becomes known as seldom reaches destination. Now, that's true of rum. It's also potentially true sometimes of the finer cuts of meat, which make their way through the hands of the pretty well-positioned quartermaster, we might say, who ultimately has the final say on what food goes where within the frontline companies. And being mates with a quartermaster, Spence, I guess, was probably a pretty good gig in the First World War.
Oh, it absolutely was. And just as a little side note, because I was bringing some of our family history here, I had a great-grandfather. I only recently discovered this, actually. A great-grandfather on my mother's side who tried to enlist in the infantry in 1914. He was too small and he actually got sent away. But he ended up being a brewer in the Army Service Corps for the entire war. He'd been a brewer pre-war, brewed throughout the First World War and brewed after the war. And I often thought that's probably a pretty good billet to be around where the breweries, or best mates with the quartermaster. And so there's always an element there. And it also means, actually, if you were a quartermaster, especially if you're a good quartermaster who really took care of his men, you'd often get all kinds of gifts in return, usually cigarettes. People would slip you a pack of cigarettes, either as a thanks for what you've been doing or as a way to say, oh, look after my company, look after my platoon in the future. But it's interesting that a difference, I think, that we mentioned previously that the armies have is, as well as tins, as well as food coming up to the front line, there's more of a capacity to cook in and around the front line than perhaps there was in the past. In Napoleon's day, you're going to have to make a fire, you're going to have to try and gather something up. And one thing that is true, I think, if you read any sort of account of Napoleonic warfare by someone who's there, is by the end of a day, even if you're just marching, everybody was completely shattered. You'd half cook your potatoes if you cooked them at all. You'd gnaw on some green apples, and you'd probably eat a partially cooked chicken and give yourself a bad stomach. By the time of the First World War, armies are much, much better at cooking food, which is extremely important. And I have to mention a particular innovation of the British, which is the Sawyer stove, which is a light field cooker. Goes to the British armies everywhere in the First World War, Western Front, Balkan Front, Middle Eastern Front, and it's a really great piece of kit. It's light, it's resilient, can take a beating and keeps cooking. Crucially, it's easy to clean, because if it's not easy to clean, soldiers just won't bother cleaning it, and you can cook quite a lot of stuff on there. You can cook soup, bread, or roast meat, and perhaps most impressively of all, it can use just about anything that burns as a fuel. So it runs on coal, probably the best, wood, probably second best. It even runs on camel dung, which, of course, in the Middle East, you've got plenty of. Anything, really. As long as it's going to be able to catch fire and be set and produce heat, it'll work. And in fact, even today, the HQ of the British Royal Logistics Corps, the RLC, jokingly referred to, and apologies if you are a member of the RLC, to the rather large corps, still bears the name Sawyer's House. That's their headquarters in present-day Britain in memory of the Sawyer stove, because it's such a big breakthrough on soldiers' lives. And I've mentioned there about the sort of the things you might cook on the Sawyer stove. You've mentioned, of course, adding all sort of condiments, sauces, salt, peppers, if they're available, and this sort of thing. And perhaps nothing more captures the use whatever you have available than the soups of the First World War, because the British, the French, and the Germans, and the Americans, when they arrive, they all make soup behind the lines, because it's a great way to just empty anything you've got in there, brew it up, and see what happens. And I have to actually read a quote out from the German side here. This is from Ernst Junger, author of Storm of Steel. Very interesting character, incredible life. He remembered in his memoirs a German soup, and he remembers the men had boiled up a soup in which you could stand your spoon out of bully beef, potatoes, peas, carrots, artichokes, and various other vegetables. And most of those vegetables had been pilfered, it had to be said, from French civilians. But what's interesting to me is they're using bully beef, which is effectively bully beef they captured from the British. They don't want to eat it cold or just straight at the tin. Throw it in the soup. And these soups are pretty legendary, whether they're British, French, or German. And though we might crinkle our noses or roll our eyes at these soups that are made up of really anything you've got on hand, if you're a cook, throw in anything, boil it up, let it marinate for a while. In actual fact, the arrival of soups at the front line, again, reading memoirs, especially in the cold or the wet, or after a period of action, if a unit is resting, soldiers really like these soups. They might not be gastronomical miracles, but I can imagine, Dan, big canteen of soup comes up, usually transported in a very, very big container. Looks a bit like something you transport milk in those days. Indeed, that container is based on the milk containers. Big batch of soup arrives. You're cold and wet. You're tired. Perhaps you've been fighting. You're not going to turn your nose up, even if it isn't necessarily the tastiest soup that's ever been made.
Yeah, very true. And, we do see examples of this. The famous Dixies, of which a couple of men who are in a reserve position will take from the quartermaster in the field kitchen, run them up the line. The luckiest guys, of course, are the first to get visited. Maybe after an hour or so, you might find that soup's not very hot anymore. Famously, in 1917, a man of the Hertfordshire Regiment I've studied in the past said by the time his tea arrived to him in the Ypres salient, they literally had to knock the ice off the top of it in order to pour it out to him. So depending where you are in the line at the time, it could sometimes be very pleasant, other times perhaps less so. It's interesting, though, that you mentioned that Germans using bully beef. And I wonder what date that was, because famously in 1914, bully beef is thrown over during the iconic Christmas truce exchange with the Germans, who throw some alternative German food back. And to quite a lot of laughter on the British side, their gift of bully beef is returned with one spoonful out of it and a few swear words back to the British line. It's quite sharpish. So apparently in 1914, it wasn't great for German palates. Maybe that changed as the situation did. But yeah, Spence, the story of food is one that we could go on about forever, and no doubt we could do multiple episodes. What's really interesting, though, is, for me at least, is how you get this divide. So we've really been looking a lot about the story of the feeding in the front lines. And in a moment, I think we maybe switch over to what food's like behind the lines, because certainly for the men of the time, that was perhaps the more exciting culinary experience. But just before we do that, just very briefly, at least from a British perspective, to give you guys an idea of what a kind of typical 24-hour frontline trench experience might look like, it gives you an idea at least of how a day might be structured and how food arrives. Of course, it would start with the famous stand to, fixing bayonets and awaiting the enemy attack pre-dawn, just as dawn rises, and that's really the start of the kind of working day. That's famously followed by the rum ration, great in winter just to warm up the bones and get people moving a little bit. Then it's going to be followed by breakfast. Now, this is, as we've said, is quite often it's going to be cooked up. It's stuff that's been brought up during the night, the famous active period in trench warfare. This is going to be your bacon, your cheeses, maybe even some eggs that have been snaffled from behind the lines, and a fairly high-calorie diet. That's going to be consumed slightly before the compulsory wash and shave. Very important to stay hygienic in the frontline trenches, usually using the last few mouthfuls of your breakfast tea as shaving water. Something just a little side note here, Spence. Actually, one of the side products, if you like, of tinned meat and breakfast and food in the trenches is actually that the hygiene is really struggles as a result. Because of course, is famously, rather than recycling his tins and recycling his food, he's just flinging it out into no man's land. And no man's land really resembles something of a rubbish dump by about 1916. Is going to become a veritable breeding ground for all kinds of nasty stuff. But moving on, weapons cleaning, of course, is going to happen in the morning, so 10 a.m. Only half of troops ever going to do that at the same time. Bad idea to get attacked when everybody's got their weapons in pieces. Then inspections, normal duties, and then midday you have your lunch. This is almost always, or wherever possible, it's going to be that hot meal you've just described, Spence, coming up by a carrying party. So maybe stew coming up in Dixies, hopefully still hot, and often arrives as well. Popular time of the day arrives with the mail, which might come with letters. It might also come with a few parcels, those condiments we've been talking about to spice up that food. And then as we go on throughout the day, eventually stand to once again, stand down a sentry go, and then supper or dinner, which is that famous soup in many occasions. That brings us through to the night. So that's what a typical day might look like in the front lines, Spence. But of course, people aren't in the front lines all the time. And it's true of all nations. Very, very often, in fact, majority of their time, they're behind the lines. And that's where you can get much more inventive with food in the food on the Western Front. And it's much more exciting for the guys behind the lines too.
It is. And something that's, I think, a little bit forgotten in our story of the First World War is the appearance of soldiers in effectively the same areas over and over again. The stalemate of the Western Front means that generally British, German, French troops are occupying similar areas, creates a internal wartime economy in these areas. If you're a civilian living in these areas, or you're a civilian living in a town where any army is regularly stationing troops or passing troops through, one of the primary ways that you can earn money, whether you're under occupation or if you're actually on the Allied side of the line, is you can start selling food. Soldiers always want food, and because the rations, although substantial in calorie intake, are monotonous, the allure of fresh food or unusual food, or above all else, perhaps for the British, alcohol, is almost irresistible. And there is this fascinating internal economy, and it also feeds the Germans as well in parts of occupied France and parts of occupied Belgium too, where locals who can access food will run cafes or even just stalls effectively out of their own front door where you can sell something, fresh eggs, fresh vegetables, fresh cakes and bread and so on. It has to be said that these institutions, these eateries, are more common on the Allied side of the line, especially after 1916. The mood on the German side of the line changes. There's a lot of forced deportations, taking French and Belgian labourers back to Germany. The food situation tightens up quite significantly, and so there's less of it goes on. But it continues pretty much right until the end of the war. And you can imagine, listeners, that you're a Tommy, for example, you've been eating nothing but tin food, bully beef, and your bit of soup. And then you're on a bit of leave, perhaps, you've got a little bit of a break behind the lines, and suddenly somebody offers you an opportunity to eat ham, egg, and chips. If you've got some money in your pocket, you're probably going to take that. And I'm not sure we can blame them, Dan.
No, I love a bit of ham, egg, and chips. In fact, I had it on the Somme last week. It's amazing, actually, when you think about these kind of things and how it becomes. Some of these meals are so popular, they actually get transported back to the UK and become a really staple diet at home. So ham, egg, and chips, popularised on the First World War, on the Western Front. Walk into any cafe somewhere in a kind of working class area of town somewhere, you're going to find ham, egg, and chips on the menu. It's a great, nutritious meal, much more interesting than the stuff you'd be getting in the front lines. Of course, can be spiced up, can also be taken with a nice glass of white wine or the infamous plonk alongside it. So there's lots of different things which can be taken. And the idea of these, what are known as estaminets, being created behind the lines. And this could be anything from a kind of dedicated pre-war cafe to somebody who's just got a living room and a stove in their house and is going to cater for Tommy walking down the street, and they're going to try and make a little bit of money, depending on, if they're very lucky, maybe you've got some Canadians turned up into the area who get paid significantly larger, and you hike your prices up. And then when the Brits come by, they grumble because they they're not going to pay Canadian prices, as they quite often tell people. And the French come by and they're not even going to pay British prices because they paid so much less. But there are these opportunities, and you can't blame people who are in such dangerous situations for trying to make a living whilst doing that. And to be perfectly fair, Tommy's quite happy to pay it as well. They want to make their lives that little bit easier. It's remarkable to me how some of these situations occur, and it reminds me, Spence, if you allow the segue, one little story from a guy in the second division in 1915, who exactly what I just alluded to there, comes into an area which has previously been occupied by the first Canadian division, who are fairly new into theatre but have a lot more money, and so the price of chicken since the last time this guy's been there has gone up about tenfold, and no longer is it possible to buy the chicken in this French lady's backyard. So in the evening, they decide to go in. They steal the chicken, they kill the chicken, they pluck it, and they powder it, and then they present it to her the following morning and say, "Oh, we got this sent from home. Would you mind? Would you mind cooking it for us?" To which she does at a much more reasonable price, not realizing it's her own chicken stolen from the night before. And I'm sure there's plenty of stuff like that goes on that we know certainly behind the lines. The Army Service Corps, perhaps the less scrupulous members, perhaps sell spare stock, we could say, to estaminates behind the line, quite often alcohol, service rum, amongst other things. But this thriving economy idea, I find really fascinating in a sense. And quite often when we look at memoirs and things of that kind, Spence, we maybe expect to see lots about the fighting and the gruesome aspects. And whilst there are bits of that, there's always a lot about kind of life behind the lines and food and those kind of experiences. And that, in many ways, for veterans, that's a bigger deal, which is quite surprising.
It's very true. And I suppose as historians, military historians, battlefield guides, we're sometimes we're drawn to, we want to read about action and what was it like and how did you fight. But of course, if you consider that the average soldier on the Western Front doesn't spend that much time fighting, strictly on the British side of the line, you're going to spend a lot more time resting, training, especially from 1917 onwards, than you are actually in full-scale battle. Food and the simple joy of having good food is really, really important. And I think this is why veterans focus on it so much in so many of their memoirs. And also this crops up a lot in wartime or post-war, I should say, novels set during wartime. There's a lot of talk about food. And we have to remember, listeners, that the diet, as we've laid out, high in calories, monotonous, and the simple pleasure of having a different meal with fresh ingredients, cooked by a civilian with probably a lot more care and attention than either you and your mates can do around the Sawyer stove or your cooks can do on the field kitchens. Simple pleasure, and especially if you eat it perhaps in the company of friends, and sharing food is a universal language across humanity. It's a real pleasure. And it's a moment of happiness after you've potentially been on trench duty or even in battle for a long time. And so the joy of a good food really can't be underestimated in a war that, for, as we've said on a previous episode, is about 90% bored stiff, 9% frozen stiff, and 1% scared stiff. Throwing in some good, hot, home-cooked food is an absolute joy to pretty much any soldier. And one thing to sort of consider in that is this is a joy that is enjoyed overwhelmingly by the Allies, especially from 1916 onwards, because the German rations, initially pretty generous, similar level to the British, will start to go into decline from 1916 onwards, round about the same time that the informal economy of cafes behind the lines begins to reduce, never disappears completely, but reduces. And in 1916, the German army actually introduces a meatless day once a week for all frontline troops. And even when you're eating meat on the front line as a German, your meat ration falls from 375 grams of meat a day to 250 grams of meat a day. Sugar ration also falls. And by 1917, German daily rations are effectively in permanent decline. They're never going to recover to the pre-1916 standard. By late 18, in some parts of the front, they're down to sub 2,000 calories a day. And that's really hard on you. That's going to cause you to lose weight, reduce your immune system, make you more vulnerable to the Spanish flu and so on. And even when you're getting food, it's often substitute food or ersatz food. It's not good. Ersatz coffee is absolutely notoriously undrinkable. It's sort of powdered blackness. It's tastes bad. It's made out of a variety of things. It's a composite of different grains and granules that produces something a bit like coffee, but not really like coffee. No substitute for the real thing. And above all else, K-brot bread, which is K-brot is a composite word combining the German word for war and the German word for potatoes. And K-brot is made from potatoes, but it's also made from other things: oats, barley, even compressed straw at some occasions. Pretty much anything that the Germans can get their hands on produces this compact, rather grim-looking squat loaf, which is a bit soggy by all accounts. It doesn't really firm up properly when it's baked. And it's mainly eaten initially on the home front, but soon it starts arriving on the Western Front as well, and it is universally disliked. In fact, it's so disliked the German government produces a sustained, and it lasts the entire war, propaganda campaign to promote K-brot bread and make out on the home front, they promote it as the German soldier loves K-brot bread, you should enjoy it too. For the German soldier on the front line, they say, listen, we know this isn't the best bread, but the civilians at home are eating it so that you can fight, so don't complain if you get a loaf or two of this. But these kind of substitutions, the quality of calories is poor, the nutritional value is poor, soldiers don't like them. It's pretty grim. So we've painted this picture, I think, Dan, up until this point, that food on the Western Front is one thing you're probably going to be okay with. But let's not forget, if you're on the German side, especially from 17 onwards, it's going to get a lot harder. And one thing to note, too, is the nature of the German defense in depth system we've discussed many times on this podcast. If you're out in the forward zone, in these scattered checkerboard defensive positions, getting big meals up to you is actually quite difficult. There's not necessarily a trench route can take it to you. So what the Germans actually using in some cases is they use dogs, dispatch dogs carrying mess tins with your serving of soup that can pick their way through the rubble and the wreckage of no man's land so you can get it. Not completely reliable, and crucially, although these are very useful dogs, well trained, they simply can't carry that much food. And so frontline forward zone troops, especially by 1918, often underfed. If they do get their ration, it's carried by dog, and it's not very nice. It's usually cold. No wonder that by late 1918, when the Allies are capturing German soldiers, they're staggered at how small and skinny they've become.
Yeah, and also on the other side of that coin as well, when the Germans do advance in March 1918, it's very interesting how they find exactly the opposite. In fact, there are a couple of famous incidents where actually the momentum is taken out of the attack of the German spring offensive because Germans are quite simply coming across stores of rations that they haven't seen for years. And it takes away all their desire to keep pushing forward. And instead, they understandably want to fill their pockets with rations and these kind of things that were a real luxury by 1918 for German troops. So this kind of chalk and cheese method, I think, to an extent, particularly in the latter part of the war, has a real morale component to it. You know, Germans, the situation, as you've quite rightly said, is just declining from 1917 onwards. It's never going to be really sustainable, either on the fighting front or on the home front. Now, if you compare that with the might and the manpower and the resource power that, for example, the Americans bring to the war when they arrive in big numbers in 1918, it's off the scale. It's completely different. In fact, you know, the Americans, I think, Spence, in a sense, are a really good case study to understand kind of how things look and how even we famously talk about evolution of the fighting front, evolution of the logistics train, and evolution of the way to feed a soldier actually occurs throughout the war as well.
It's absolutely true when it comes to the American Army and the US Army. We talked about this in our US Army series. It tries to approach the war in a very scientific way. And uniquely in 1918, it forms the food division of the Surgeon General's office to really take a good study on what is the average doughboy eating, is it good for them, how many calories they're eating. And even then, nutritional science is really in its infancy in the First World War. People know if you eat a lot of food, you gain weight. If you eat a lot of meat, you tend inclined to gain muscle if you're exercising. But beyond that, it's still pretty nebulous stuff. But what the stated aim of the food division of the Surgeon General's office it's tied to a great quote, which is, good food makes well-muscled men with plenty of fighting spirit. And listeners, I'll leave it to you if you agree with this statement, but certainly in the context of 1918, there's truth behind it. You're not going to produce well-muscled men who are fired up and full of action if they're underfed and they're constantly hungry. And the US Food Division does the largest survey, probably, well, the most detailed survey, certainly, of exactly how much does an army eat, and focusing overwhelmingly on the US Army. And its survey in summer 18 finds that US Army infantrymen eats between 2,300 and 3,400 calories a day in spring and summer. Now, there's quite a wide variation there, and they attribute that a lot to local supply and regional supply. It can vary a lot depending on where you are in the USA. But they also find that the US Army eats more meat than any other army at war. And the US Army always emphasizes its meat content. And given the scale of farming across the Midwest and parts of the South, there's always a ready supply of fresh meat, especially for soldiers training actually in the USA. And the US Food Department also gives us what they describe as a typical doughboy's daily diet in summer 1918. And have a listen to this, listeners, and see if it sounds appealing to you. So, breakfast is oatmeal, pork sausages, fried potatoes, bread and butter, and coffee. Lunch, roast beef, baked potatoes, bread and butter, cornstarch pudding, and coffee. And dinner, beef stew, cornbread, syrup, prunes, and tea. And then on top of that, the Food Division estimates that doughboys eat about 500 calories in addition to this of cakes, chocolate, and sweets on top of it. So that's a pretty hefty diet, Dan. I think that sounds pretty filling to me.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm pretty hungry right now. And I was listening to you say that. I thought that's not bad at all. There's some really nice. That's some really nice numbers and obviously plenty of interest there. Again, repeatedly, does it get monotonous? Yeah, I'm sure it does. But there are other tricks and things that can be added. And just one thing, I almost want to go back a bit, Spence, actually, because it reminded me of something a moment ago when we were talking about bringing in meat specifically, because there's a really important point here, and you can almost compare it back with Napoleon's time and these kind of things. Frozen meat and tinned meat has a distinct advantage over what would have previously been done, which would have been moving livestock. The only way to keep it fresh is to keep the damn thing alive in the first place. You can get a lot more frozen meat. You can get a lot more tinned meat in that you could ever get livestock. And when ships and shipping is at a premium, particularly when you're trying to ship troops at the same time, being able to pack in large quantities of supplies into very small areas is an absolutely vital element. And actually, it's really key in 1918 because not only are the Americans trying to get themselves over there, they're trying to get the products they need to sustain themselves. South America being a huge one for meat supply. So loads of different elements to bring in. But by the time we get to 1918, things are just looking that much slicker.
And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that America has entered the war, and with it, it's brought this huge amount of shipping as well, which defeats the German U-boat campaign almost by just that act alone. A lot more to it, listeners, and I'm sure we'll cover that in the future. But it unlocks a huge amount of shipping, and combined with British, French, and American shipping, now even more supply can be brought onto the Western Front. And even by the standards of the British and the French, the Americans' diet is impressive. They're eating a lot of food. And a great quote from a French civilian in a liberated area of down in France, in the Alsace-Lorraine region, if I remember correctly, who remembered, he was a child at the time, and remembered enduring memory of Americans was that they were, and I quote, men who chew gum all day long with their gold teeth. The Americans were always eating, it seemed to this French civilian. And so this overwhelming weight of supply is absolutely crucial. In fact, after the war, the US Food Department has a look at the soldiers, and it estimates that the average doughboy who isn't wounded or captured during the war at any point, isn't invalided out of the line for any reason, who survives the war intact and without being captured, on average, they gain 12 pounds. That's an impressive gain of weight, and it gives you some idea about how much food the average US soldier is eating. When we consider the average US soldier is a bit bigger than the average European soldier anyway, that's quite an impressive feat. And of course, it also has a moral purpose. We've mentioned before, Germans getting increasingly downhearted about their lack of food, and also the quantities the Allies obviously have. Listeners, if you remember our discussion of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, it's about the only time in the war the American army is poorly fed, because its supply system collapses. And you read accounts, memoirs of the Americans on Meuse Argonne. Overwhelmingly, soldiers who had that shortage, they complain about lack of food. They really do. So food is an absolutely essential moral component. It's not just sustaining your calories. It's without it, or if it diminishes, you lose so much fighting effectiveness. You lose so much heart. And I've seen it said, I'm not sure I'd go to bat on this. I'm not sure I'd produce it in a conference paper or anything like that. But if the Germans had somehow been able to sustain their food supplies to the same level of the Allies, incidentally, it varies from army to army, it varies from front to front, but in general, the daily calorie ration by 1918 is about 3,200 calories a day, rising up to about 4,000 in winter. So lots and lots of calories compared to the German ration, which is ostensibly that level, but is falling in some cases down to about 2,000 or below. And I've even seen it suggested that if somehow the Germans had been able to reorganize their food supplies, perhaps take advantage of all the territory they captured from Imperial Russia and boost up the German rations, it's a huge what if, it's a huge speculation, then perhaps they'd have actually been strong enough to hold the line. Now, that's a little bit of a sort of zany what if, but I think it just gets across just how incredibly important food is. Without food, if you're leaving your troops underfed, day after day, week after week, and asking them to undertake really hard physical challenges, including just simply living in the cold and the unsanitary conditions of the Western Front, well, you're not gonna have an effective army for very long.
Yeah, and do you know, even if I think look at it as it really its most basic level, and I think all of us to a certain extent can kind of imagine this scenario. Let's take out the fighting element for a moment. Let's take out all of the other elements, and let's just get two soldiers and get them to just stay in a trench for as long as they can. As simple as that might be. If you get one in there that's getting regular food all the time and getting fed, well fed, and has that kind of additional energy, they undoubtedly are going to be able to sustain longer than the guy that's getting underfed. I think it's as simple as that. And the more you burn energy in things like fighting, the quicker those reserves are going to deplete, and the quicker your morale is going to drop. So there's so many things I think that are underpinned by the idea of being able to, as Napoleon probably said, either an army marches on its stomach or maybe fights on its stomach. There's certainly some truth in it. And no doubt the guys in the front line knew it as well. And clearly the British Army, the American Army, and the German Army too knew it. And that's why such great efforts were made to feed those men on the front lines in the Great War. It's a fascinating subject, one that no doubt we'll come back to with different elements as we continue with this story. It's a pleasure as always, and that brings us to the end of today's episode. I just want to finish, Spence, whilst we're talking, just a quick plug for our Doughboys at War Tour, because we've had loads of interest. In fact, tickets are very nearly sold out for those that want to come along and join us on the Western Front, where we'll explore, amongst other things, rations in the front line. Spence, just a quick one. What else are we going to cover, and what are we looking forward to? What are you looking forward to specifically?
Well, I'm fascinated by the fact we get to cover more or less the entire American Expeditionary Forces experience, from early actions around Belleau Wood right up to the big push at Meuse Argonne as well. And these are battlefields that, of course, they are explored by visitors, but they're not explored perhaps as much as they should compared to the number of visitors who pour into Ypres, Verdun, the Somme. They're really a little bit more obscure, perhaps. So we're going to be visiting battlefields where you don't get many visitors. In many cases, they're largely untouched. It's always striking how little has changed around Belleau Wood, for example. We're going to get a really great ground view of this. Going to have a really great sort of narrative where you can understand how the army evolves, how the battlefields change, and put into on the ground everything we've been talking about on the podcast. And of course, we'll be reiterating on the tour. And since we've been talking about food, well, there might just be us calling in and having some ham, egg, and chips together at a suitable French eatery as well. And why not? Let's top it off with a bottle of Plonk.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. The one thing I missed was the American chips thing. I should have added that in. So you know that one?
Oh,
So chips of potatoes, which are literally what the Belgians do. So they chip the potatoes up, chuck them in a fryer, and that's where we British get chips. Americans arrive in the French-speaking part of Belgium, call them French fries because it's French-speaking, but French fries are actually a Belgian invention, popularised by the Americans in the First World War incorrectly as a French dish. There we go.
The fact that there's not a lot of measuring going on here, just throw everything in, whoops, with a bit of water. Just do that again because I bashed my microphone.
Labelled SRD, so a couple of suggestions where this might come. A couple of suggestions where this might come from. It's either what is it? Supply reserve depot, and bollocks, what's the other one? There we go. Got an outtake, Linus. Right.